Ba 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 ra ba ba ra ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ra ba ba ra ba 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 ba. Salutations and welcome, friends. I'm your host, Matthew DeSantis, and welcome to Amalfi Sports. And in this episode, we're going to be recapping an absolutely crazy 2 hours that took place on Saturday, July 17th, between the racetracks of Saratoga and Monmouth, and one in upstate New York, the other in New Jersey. And I'll be honest, those 2 hours may have come to define horse racing in 2021, or at least serve as an epitome of what horse racing is, an encapsulation of what horse racing is in 2021. Now, before we get started, just a quick reminder to press that subscribe button on the Amalfi YouTube channel so you can get the latest horse racing picks, previews, and analyses every single week as we go from tracks from coast to coast and even over to the pond to England. And so you want to be able to get all of those coverage. You want to be able to get all of those picks, the favorites, the dark horses, the long shots that you need to play, get all of that handicapping information every week with us here at Amalfi Media. Finally, if you'd like to keep up with my daily horse racing conversations, make sure to follow me on Twitter at the handle @FailedToMenace. Again, at the Twitter handle @FailedToMenace. Well, with that said, let's dive into what was really an unreal day of racing on Saturday that featured some very high highs and unfortunately some very low lows. But let's start with one of the higher highs, and let's start with the Sanford Stakes at Saratoga. This was a race that I had previewed with the Diana, and this was a race I was really eagerly anticipating, focused on that 2-year-old crop, and a very exciting race of up-and-coming thoroughbreds, obviously getting a sneak preview of next year's Triple Crown runners potentially. And as I mentioned in the preview, the class of that race was Wit, and Wit demonstrated what a class he is in, and perhaps a class by himself compared to the other horses in the field. Wit was absolutely dominant in his performance, threw up a 90 Beyer speed number, which was a 20-point improvement over his first race, which he also won. The amazing thing about Witt's performance was he still did not break particularly well out of the gate, was kind of mid-pack through most of the race. But man, the move he made around the fourth turn was absolutely incredible. Trust Our Journey was, not surprisingly, the pace setter. And, it looked like Trust Our Journey might actually have a pretty good ride. And all of a sudden, Witt just came storming around 5 or 6 horses and swung out wide. It did not matter that the horse ran wide. It did not matter that it did not save ground. That horse had an acceleration that none of the other horses did in that field, and really just put the rest of the field away. Gary Stevens said on the broadcast that he got goosebumps watching that sort of a move. And you don't want to draw too many parallels, but a lot of people talk about the move that Secretariat made up at Saratoga at the Hopeful, which is another 2-year-old race that's later this summer. And again, sometimes when you watch these 2-year-olds, you just don't know how they're going to respond. These were still very green horses. Most of them were in their second or maybe third race. And so to see Witt put on that sort of a display was very impressive. Now, it's important to point out, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. Goosebumps aside, the sort of moves aside, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves because this was still only 6 furlongs. And Witt's got to be able to prove in future races that he can continue to stretch out to a longer distance, go up against different competition. And so there's a lot there still to be tested with Witt. But what a first real major test with some really quality competition. Headline Report, Wesley Ward's horse came in second. Dance Code came in third. Ottoman Empire, who I mentioned, I liked kind of coming in on a ticket as a trifecta or superfecta bet, came in fourth, which is Tom and Moss's trained horse. Those rounded out the top 4. Trust Our Journey, I mentioned, was a horse that went out really fast. Again, like I said in the preview, I think that horse's future as a sprint horse and much shorter distances. It just doesn't have the tank. Wit does seem to have the tank. I mean, that horse seemed to be able to run for days. And so you don't want to get too far ahead of yourself. There have been plenty of instances recently where 2-year-olds, Obesos is probably the best recent example, just last year actually, looked dominant as a 2-year-old and just didn't really put everything together as a 3-year-old, didn't really improve. So we need to see what Witt is going to continue to do throughout his 2-year-old campaign into next year. But early test tells me this is a very special horse. And it just the fact that it still didn't have a complete race is what was particularly impressive. And this is the second time now that Witt has not broken particularly well, overcome that, and still managed to do quite well. Obviously, when Witt takes a step up in competition, he's going to have to clean up that breaking issue. And I'm sure that's something that Todd Pletcher and Irad Ortiz Jr. are going to continue to work on with the horse so that you can put together a complete race, which you'll need to do when you go up against top competition. So that was one of the highest highs, I think, from Saturday, was watching that performance. I always love watching young horses burst onto the scene, and that was quite the stage for Witt to be able to do that. Now, that said, another very high actually came right after that, and that was the United Nations Stakes, which is down at Monmouth. And that was another dominant effort by the horse Tribhuvan, which is Chad Brown's horse. And that horse pretty much so led the whole way. And I was really afraid it was jockeyed by Flavien Prat, who obviously is in the news, which we'll get to a little bit later for another reason. But Flavien Prat went out fast with Tribhuvan, which I had a feeling Tribhuvan was going to be out fast. I didn't expect for Tribhuvan to be at sometimes 2-3 lengths ahead of everybody else, maybe even 4 lengths ahead of everyone else. I thought perhaps he had misjudged the horse. Apparently, I was the one who misjudged the horse, because that horse had plenty in the tank. And, coming around the final turn, I thought, well, maybe somebody's going to make a run. Nobody was able to make a run. I mean, Tribhuvan put that gas pedal down and just went. That was one of the most impressive performances I've seen out of a horse recently, and great bit of jockeying by Flavien to know exactly how much horse he had under him, and did a great job guiding Tribhuvan around on a wonderful trip. Some other takeaways from that race: Mrs. Danvers, I mentioned this in the picks and previews, bit of a fraud. I did not like that horse going into that race. That horse had one good race, and everybody seemed to bet that horse down because of one good race. And that horse still only has one good race. So Mrs. Danvers was a non-factor. Arklow, also extremely disappointing favorite that broke from the inside rail. Ended up not really being a factor at all in that race. Very disappointing effort from Arklow. Imperador, a horse I mentioned as a potential live long shot, certainly got very good value, finishing second. And so one of the interesting things about this finish, the fact that Tribhuvan is a Chad Brown horse, what was fascinating is there's now a lot of discussion about the Lasix effect and whether or not this is impacting Chad Brown horses this year. A lot of horse tracks have banned the use of Lasix. Lasix is kind of an anti-bleeding medication, but it's also a diuretic. A lot of times horses will urinate significantly before a race and drop a lot of weight, allows them to run a lot faster. And so this is something a lot of tracks have started to ban. Monmouth bans a lot of things, which we're going to talk about in a moment in terms of banning whipping, but has not banned the use of Lasix. Chad Brown horses are doing very well at Monmouth. Tribhuvan did very well at Monmouth. There are other tracks that have banned Lasix, most notably Saratoga. We're going to get to some of the Chad Brown horses at Saratoga in a second when we talk about the Diana not performing as well. Chad Brown is still winning races at Saratoga, but not nearly as many as he did last year. And so I think this is something to keep in mind looking forward and taking into consideration when you're handicapping races, looking at the Lasix effect and the Lasix impact on some of these horses at these different tracks by different trainers. You obviously want a larger sample size before you're drawing massive conclusions, but there does seem to be perhaps a little something there, and at least something to keep in the back of your mind as you're analyzing those types of impacts in the future. Like I said, Chad Brown's still doing extremely well, winning 24% of his entries, so certainly don't want to start crying for him. It's not as if he's losing everything, but it's just something to keep in mind. So the next race I wanted to preview, which was also a very high, was the Diana. And this, we're not going quite chronologically because the Haskell came next, but I want to save the Haskell discussion for last because there's a lot there to unpack. And at the Diana, following up on this Lasix conversation, the Chad Brown reign of dominance, 5 straight years, 6 wins overall. The Chad Brown reign of dominance at least has been broken for a single year, and that has been replaced by Godolphin and Charles Appleby, who's trained both Alkeitha and Summer Romance, who finished 1-2 in that race, and that was a great race to watch. Just so exciting, that home stretch with Summer Romance and Alkeitha just battling it out. The two of them, just dominant performance. And I mentioned this in the previews. Those two have gone head-to-head several times before, and it was a carbon copy of some of those races that they've run against each other before, with Summer Romance setting a strong pace early on, and Alkeitha coming hammering down the stretch, thundering down the stretch, and passing horses, and eventually pulling ahead of her stablemate in Summer Romance. Very impressive to watch. And one of the things I'll say, Summer Romance, I thought ran a phenomenal race. And I mentioned I like Summer Romance's odds, given that they were 4-1. I like the number on that, the morning line odds. Summer Romance ran as good of a race as I think it could run, in that Summer Romance set a brisk pace, but not an insane pace. And I mentioned this in the preview, where when Summer Romance gets out 3-4 horses lengths ahead of everyone else, falls apart every time. Alkeitha comes storming by, Summer Romance lags and weakens and finishes like 3rd or 4th. This time, Summer Romance set a much more sensible pace, did not run away from the field, okay, and set a strong pace, and was able to maintain a very strong pace throughout. Alkeitha just ran that much stronger of a race. I think both put up plus 100 Beyer speed numbers. I know Alkeitha put up a 102. I believe Summer Romance probably put up a 100 based on that. So very strong performance from both of them in terms of that 1-2 finish. And not surprisingly, La Signari, who's a horse I mentioned, who always ends up on the board, guess what happened? La Signari ended up on the board, ended up in 3rd place. That horse is as reliable as there is in terms of finishing 2nd or 3rd. Don't ever put any money on La Signari to win, but man, I will make sure that in any future race, I put La Signari, on my exactor trifectas, because that horse just has a habit of finishing in the money and on the board. So very strong performance from La Signari. Harvey's Little Goal finished 4th and was bit of a non-factor in the race, a decent finish, but certainly a little bit of a disappointing effort there. Did some of the rain that came down at Saratoga have an impact on the turf and Harvey Little Goal's effort? I don't know. I mean, Harvey's Little Goal didn't have a great race the previous time when the track was less than firm. So perhaps this is a horse that just does not like any sort of saturation in the turf. That said, this is obviously a huge step up in competition. So finishing 4th is not a disservice to the horse, but just something to keep in mind. The big takeaway, as I mentioned, was the Chad Brown reign of dominance being broken. His 2 horses, Lamista and Pocket Square, both performed quite poorly. And again, this is a track, Saratoga, that does not allow for Lasix on race day. So again, the potential Lasix impact was there to look at, but the real trend here, I think, was these Godolphin horses, and that's been a trend this whole year. The Sheikh has been building up that stable for years and years and years, and Godolphin has this unbelievable stable of horses, and Charles Appleby is doing a great job training them. The other thing I'll say is I am like many Americans that I am sometimes biased against European horses. I try not to be, but a lot of times in my analysis, I just find myself leaning, if it's a toss-up, I lean towards the American horse a lot of times. One of the things I think we can safely say between what's happened at the UN Stakes, between what happened at the Diana, between what happened last week at the Belmont Oaks and Belmont Derby, is there is a far better crop of European horses coming over to the United States this year than in years past. Remember last week at the Belmont Derby and the Belmont Oaks, you had Santa Barbara and Bolshoi Ballet both dominating the field, the Aidan O'Brien horses coming over. It's important to point out that a lot of times Aidan O'Brien has not brought over his best horses to the United States. He brings over long shots sometimes. So the knock on Aidan O'Brien has always been he doesn't win in the U.S. Well, he's not really giving himself an opportunity to win in the U.S. He keeps his best horses over in Europe and runs them a lot over there. You're seeing between Godolphin and Aidan O'Brien, a lot of really strong European horses coming over and dominating in these fields. And that's something, again, to just keep in mind that we have a very strong crop, I think, of European horses from Great Britain, from France, from Ireland. So it'll be really exciting to see how these horses, and the nice part is they all look like they're planning on staying here in the United States a little bit longer. They're not just coming over for one race or for, and kind of resting until the Breeders' Cup. Looks like a lot of these are going to be racing throughout the summer. So, Bolshoi Ballet and Santa Barbara both hinted at that last week. It looks like Althika and Summer Romance will probably race again before the Breeders' Cup. So, again, really exciting to see these horses run multiple times over the U.S. and potential changing the guards that is taking place in some of the turf races. So then let's get to the final race, the Haskell. And this was the one that obviously a lot of people are going to be talking about for a while. And the race itself, as they came down the stretch, played out exactly as I thought, and I think most people thought, which was it was a 4-horse race. That top tier of horses, Following Sea, Midnight Bourbon, Hot Rod Charlie, and Mandaloun were probably 15 to 18 lengths ahead of Anti-Gravity, Pick and Time, and Basso. And so those latter 3 horses were just a non-factor the entire race. It really was a 4-horse race. And as they came down the stretch, Hot Rod Charlie and Mandaloun really put on a beautiful final kick. But then, unfortunately, a lot of chaos took place. Hot Rod Charlie passes Midnight Bourbon and then drifts in front of Midnight Bourbon. Seems like they clipped heels. The horse Midnight Bourbon goes down, throws off Paco Lopez, his jockey. Hot Rod Charlie ends up going to win the race with a head bob over Mandaloun. Now, that said, Hot Rod Charlie gets DQ'd almost immediately, almost as they were interviewing the connections for Hot Rod Charlie. I think about 30 seconds after that, they DQ'd Hot Rod Charlie, and of course, the winner then became Mandaloun. So first things first, the good news from all of this is that Midnight Bourbon is okay. Reports out of New Jersey from Steve Asmussen has said that X-rays and ultrasounds came back clean. The horse has some scrapes and bruises, but is otherwise healthy and fit and in shape. So we hope to certainly see Midnight Bourbon race again, but that was a very scary moment. The other thing is Paco Lopez is okay as well, just had a minor knee injury and is actually going to be racing again today on Sunday, and will be down here near me in Virginia racing at Colonial Downs on Monday. So just extraordinarily thankful that everybody emerged from the race safe and sound, and no major injuries to either the horse or the jockey. So that was the good news. The other kind of interesting news is that it appears as if Mandaloun is going to win 2 Grade 1 stakes races this year by disqualification. Obviously won the Haskell by disqualification and will probably end up winning the Kentucky Derby by disqualification once Medina Spirit is officially disqualified for having beta-methasone in its system. So Mandaloun is, I don't want to say lucking out. There's been a couple horses that this has happened to over in Europe that have won 2 graded stakes races by disqualification, but it is extremely rare to see. And Mandaloun has put in strong efforts in both of those races. Certainly, I think a stronger effort in this race than I expected. I did not think Mandaloun was going to put up that strong of a performance. I thought Mandaloun looked like it was tiring at the Pegasus a little bit. Just felt like between the short layoff and the quality of competition, Hot Rod Charlie would really pull away. Hot Rod Charlie never pulled away, ran a very strong race, but Mandaloun was right there with Hot Rod Charlie. So certainly a worthy winner. I mean, this is not as if, Mandaloun was 5 lengths behind and ended up winning by disqualification. It was right there with Hot Rod Charlie. Could have gone either way with the head bobs. So, very interesting to see how that all played out. The big story, though, from this was the no whip controversy. And this came up almost as soon as the race was over. People were blaming the fact that at Monmouth, jockeys are not allowed to use the whip except for safety purposes. So they are allowed to go to the crop for safety purposes. But Hot Rod Charlie drifts over 2 lanes in front of Midnight Bourbon. A lot of people said if Flavien Prat had been allowed to use the whip, a left-handed whip in particular, could have kept Hot Rod Charlie in its lane, not drifted over and cut off Midnight Bourbon. Certainly, Flavian Prat has a good reputation as a jockey, not a dangerous jockey or anything like that. Paco Lopez is somebody everybody loves. So, I know that there was reports that came out that, Flavian Prat made sure to go up in the jockey's room and apologize to Paco. Everything was fine between the two of them afterwards. So there's no ill will. And so that was something, did the whip contribute to it? You heard Jerry Bailey, as soon as the race was over, saying, well, this isn't because of the whip rule. This was just, the horse drifted and had nothing to do with the use of whips. Maybe not. I don't know. It's tough to say, it's tough to play out counter hypotheticals in terms of saying, well, if the Flavian had been able to use the left-handed whip, then Hot Rod Charlie would have stayed in its lane. Maybe. It's also possible Flavian and the horse thought that they were cleared of Midnight Bourbon and started to just drift over naturally, which is not against the rules, and that's perfectly fine. And just misjudged and obviously had a pretty traumatic effect. Personally, I would have liked to have seen Monmouth and the New Jersey Racing Association adopt something more along the lines of the California whip rule, which is that a whip can be used no more than 6 times in a race. And the horses are obviously inspected after the races for excessive whip use. And so I just feel like there is something there that allows the jockeys, gives them a little bit more wiggle room, and it just avoids the what ifs, and it avoids the constant questioning of this. And again, many of these jockeys are very, respectful of the horses and are very conscientious of using the whip and knowing that horses are not going to respond to it after a while. So you don't overuse something that the horse is not going to respond to. But it was just one of those moments that it was just so devastating to see the crash and the spill, and it happened on national TV. It just seems as if this has been such a good year, and it just seems at all the wrong moments things go wrong in the eyes of the general public between Baffert and Medina Spirits, allegations of doping for betamethasone and the suspensions of Baffert getting a lot of headline press. And then something like this, obviously a crown jewel event on NBC, millions of people watching, and then this happens in the whip rule. And what I will say is, the other thing is Monmouth, sits there, bans the whip rule, does ban Lasix. So you have to wonder, how worried are they about the horses? Because they're not banning Lasix at all. They're banning the whips and the crop use. But it's also important to point out that in the harness races later that night at the Meadowlands Park in New Jersey, the jockeys are allowed to use whips. So, listen, I'm originally from Pennsylvania. There's not a lot of love lost for me for the state of New Jersey. This is a state that thinks jug handles are a good idea, and still has on any weekend night, you can go to a high school gymnasium and watch professional wrestling where people are playing in barbed wire matches and exploding thumbtack matches. So, New Jersey doesn't legislate a whole lot of things, but seems to have really stepped in it with this rule, in my opinion. Again, would have it changed the outcome of the race? I don't know. We can't know. We can't say, oh, yes, this definitely would have done it one way or the other. But just it would have removed some of the questioning. So, again, it's just frustrating to see this happen on such a big stage, to such great horses, to jockeys who have good reputations. It's just such a sad thing to see. And again, thankful everyone is okay. That's the most important thing. All of us who love horse racing love horses. We have so much respect for the jockeys and the trainers who do things the right way. And it is just so fortunate to see everybody emerge from this situation okay. And it unfortunately ruined what was a very, very special and exciting race down the stretch. I mean, it was a thrilling race at the Haskell, just unfortunately marred by this very unfortunate moment. So again, some really high highs over the weekend. The other really positive high came out of Saratoga, where they announced $32 million had been wagered on Saturday alone at Saratoga. That's a 19% increase from 2 years ago. So listen, folks, people are coming back to the tracks after the pandemic. There's more interest than ever. That's a wonderful thing to see. I hope we focus on the positives after this weekend and some wonderful performances from some great horses. Well, listen, that's it for today. But remember to tune back later this week, Thursday or Friday. We're going to be posting a video. We're going to be going across the pond to jolly old England. Might have to trade out this hat for a top hat. I don't know, but we'll have to see. And we're going to preview a pair of graded stakes races at the Ascot racetrack over there in England for the Princess Margaret Stakes, as well as the King George VI and Queen Elizabeth Stakes. Should be really exciting. Again, Princess Margaret for those 2-year-olds and the King George VI, Queen Elizabeth Stakes for the older horses. So should be a really thrilling weekend. I'm going to be coming to you with a preview for that later this week. But remember, we're going to have previews for a lot of racetracks: Del Mar, Saratoga, Colonial Downs, Charlestown Downs, Santa Anita, and so much more. And remember, the best way to get all of this is to subscribe to the Amalfi Media YouTube channel to get the latest on Amalfi sports and horse racing. And remember to follow me at the Twitter handle @FailToMenace. Well, listen, folks, enjoy the rest of your day. And until next time, I'm Matthew DeSantis, and it's now post time.